Since the start of 2024, there has been a ton of discussion regarding Ukraine's drone strikes on Russian oil infrastructure. And, to be fair, that makes sense. The number and depth of these attacks on Russian soil has been surprising, as this ever-expanding, dramatic, rapid-fire recap hopefully illustrates. And although the logic of Russia can't sell oil, the money runs out, and the war ends is straightforward enough, it belies some of the more complicated economic problems that Russia may soon be facing. It is not just that, before the war began, 43% of Russian exports were from the fuel and oil industry. Rather, it is that the entire Russian economy is distorted to accommodate that industry. So blow it up, and the aftershocks will tremble through every remaining fiscal decision within the country. Thus, today we will begin by explaining how natural resource booms can poison the rest of a country's economy. And yes, that is the disease with a funny name. Then we will cover the obvious sanctions strategy that exists in light of the above. How the West only made partial headway on this at the start of the war. How the Russian economy stayed resilient as a result. What Ukraine is currently doing to finally press the issue, and what that means for the near future in the war. Oh, and there will be an Easter egg hidden in one of the images. I'll reveal it at the end. But we begin with the problem with natural resource booms. This is also known as Dutch disease. 2 years ago, I did a full video on it, so if you want an earlier treatment of how the world felt about the subject at the time, you can refer back to that one. Side note, this video has seen 3 major viewership spikes. The first happened right after I published it, which is a normal occurrence for any generic video. But then there was another spike in the middle of March 2023, and a third in the middle of March 2024. I do not know if this is a coincidence or if there is a reason that the Ides of March coincide with renewed interest in Dutch disease. If you have a theory, though, please post it in the comments, because I am all out of ideas. Anyway, the problem gets its name from something that the Netherlands experienced in the 1960s, following the discovery of the Groningen gas field, and I apologize to viewers in the Netherlands for having to hear me butcher that name. Regardless, we will skip straight to the applied problem for Russia today. Suppose that your economy has 3 major sectors: natural resource extraction, here oil and gas, manufacturing, and service, like fancy restaurants, sports, and other forms of entertainment. And good news for your country. Way out in the wilderness, you have just discovered vast oil and gas deposits. Now, how does this affect your economy overall? Well, first, there will be an influx of labor to the extraction sector. You need warm bodies to pull everything out of the ground. That said, oil and gas are more capital-intensive industries than other extractive ventures. As such, the pull from labor in manufacturing and service will not be too bad. In any case, though, soon money will start coming in from abroad, as people worldwide want to buy your oil. Consequently, your country becomes richer, and that is a good thing. However, this process also causes some downstream effects elsewhere in the economy. Those getting rich from the oil industry will want to start enjoying their newfound wealth. They can now afford some of the finer things in life, so they begin purchasing premium goods from foreign manufacturers. However, they also live in Russia. Thus, aside from the occasional Parisian vacation or such, they will be doing the vast majority of their discretionary spending inside of the Federation. So while they may be selling oil in dollars or euros, eventually they need to convert those back to rubles to eat caviar in Moscow. So that expansion of the extraction sector also puts the service industry on a power play. So far, so good. Unfortunately, though, the manufacturing sector is about to get wrecked. Because the ruble is now more expensive, manufacturing is less competitive on the export market. But the stronger ruble means that generic imports are cheaper for the average Russian. Although it is the energy sector that is driving the demand for rubles, Russian consumers still benefit because international markets actively want to acquire the currency. In turn, at the margins, it becomes cheaper for everyone to buy imports. And to top it all off, labor is shifting to meet demand in the service sector, so domestic manufacturers need to pay more to keep someone manning the factories. This, finally, is where the Dutch disease lies. The manufacturing sector begins to look anemic. Again, the economy is better overall as a consequence of the discovery, but there are winners and losers within the country. This is where the West's obvious sanctioning strategy lied circa February 2022. If Western countries could simply kill the energy sector, the rest of the sectors would fall like dominoes. You see, the service sector relies on customers with large discretionary incomes to sell its goods. If the extensive oil and gas money were to ever dry up, the service sector would fall apart as well. Ordinarily, this would allow the manufacturing sector to undergo a period of renewed growth. That would all be thanks to the ruble's value tumbling, thereby making Russian exports more competitive. In addition, there would be a surplus of cheap labor looking for employment. However, in Russia's case, there would be many hurdles with this recovery process. The problem here is that Russia's manufacturing sector has hollowed out for so long that it would take an extensive period of reinvestment for manufacturing to begin firing on all cylinders. However, it is hard to convince investors to do that when facing temporary, but not necessarily short-term, economic sanctions that cut off access to international markets. Just imagine the difficulty of investors gathering the necessary capital for expansion when access to foreign creditors is gone. And it is hard to justify the investment when, due to supply constraints related to the war, but unrelated to this specific Dutch disease problem, inflation is through the roof, and the Russian central bank is having to raise interest rates to cool things. So, high uncertainty, low access to credit, and high interest rates. 3 strikes, and manufacturing was also out. And that is before considering how other manufacturers have entered the market in the meantime, leaving additional competition for Russia to stare down. All told, the economic upheaval that Dutch disease could cause in Russia risked smashing the social contract that the Kremlin has with Russian citizens. Don't worry about politics, and politics won't worry about you. In a Western dream scenario, it is possible that the backlash would have driven Putin from office. But, more likely, recognizing the threat, Putin would have simply ended the invasion of Ukraine to stem the bleeding. And the West? Well, the West did not exactly do that. The headline component of the sanctions strategy was the oil price cap. Let's zoom out a moment to get a better understanding of what's happening there. The basic idea behind international trade is that one party has a product that they are willing to sell for no less than, say, X dollars. Meanwhile, a second party wants that product and is willing to pay no more than Y dollars. If X is less than Y, then hooray, everyone wins. The spread between those two quantities has a fancy name, the trade surplus. Ordinarily, once they agree to a final price, each party obtains some portion of it. For example, if Russia was willing to sell at $50, and Germany was willing to buy at $125, and the final price agreed to was $90, then Russia would capture $40 in benefits, and Germany would capture $35. This takes us to the price cap. The idea here was to deny Russia all but the smallest amount of the surplus. In other words, force the price further to the left and reduce Russia's share of the benefits, no matter who became the ultimate trading partner. That way, Russia would not actually profit much from its oil trade. In turn, little money would go to the Russian war machine, and so the effect on the war would be negligible. On the other hand, all of the oil would stay on the international market, and thus keep gasoline prices low. It was a way for the West to have its cake and eat it too. Or as they say in Russia, eat your fish without first catching it from the waters. Or as they say in Germany, wash your fur without getting it wet. Or as they say in Ukraine, you could sit in 2 chairs. That last one really doesn't quite have the same ring to it. Anyway, This was a novel strategy that worked in theory, and it could have worked in practice if enforcement of it had not been so porous. Later in 2022, the G7 countries set $60 as the limit for the price cap. The plan was to exploit the fact that Russia used international tankers to move the crude oil, and the West could control the insurance markets and deny coverage for anyone who broke the cap. Further, there was a solution for any workaround. The West could threaten any entity importing oil above the cap with secondary sanctions. That is, sanctions that do not target the primary actor, but rather those who assist the primary actor. There were two major problems with implementing the system, though. First, that $60 figure became fixed. Though the G7 countries left the door open to adjust the number as the market value of oil changed, they did not actually do that in practice. Just like how they all agreed to wear white to the meeting, but did not actually do that in practice. Come on, Biden. When the cap began, the price of Brent oil sat at $83, meaning that Russian oil would have to sell at a $23 discount. But at various points, Brent has dropped to around $70, meaning that the Urals discount would be only $10. Not exactly what the G7 had in mind. Second, Russia began developing a shadow fleet of tankers that operated outside of the Western insurance system. Enforcing the cap here required rigorous employment of secondary sanctions, which never came to pass. The result was less a magical Christmas land of sanctions, and more of a semi-effective campaign. Buyers of Russian crude could negotiate a risk premium into the price. There was some chance that accepting Russian shipments could turn south, so Russia still had to offer lower prices to get importers to accept. Thus, the West ended with a mixed bag. The price of Urals oil has exceeded $60 for most of the cap's existence, and indeed moved to the high 70s in mid-April of 2024. The result of this weak sanctions enforcement is a Russian economy that has kept its head above the water. There have been many potential economic crises that Russia has faced during this war, and we have seen some of these in depth on this channel in previous videos. But the existence of a problem does not mean that a problem lacks a solution. It is just a puzzle to solve. And although Russia's solutions to its various problems often resemble band-aids that punt the deeper problems down the road, the key thing is that they have been working, at least so far. In this light, Russia's unsung war hero is Elvira Nabiullina, head of the Russian Central Bank since 2013. She is the one who has been primarily responsible for the Russian economy not completely imploding over the last few years. Now, the Western price cap has harmed Russia's energy sector, and in the absence of anything else, this might have caused a deeper recession due to reverberations in other sectors. But Russia stuck by the standard recession playbook. What do you do if your economy is about to collapse? Hit up the deficit spending. The government injects tons of cash into the economy, which hopefully stimulates investment and halts a potential crash. Now, deficit spending is not sustainable in the long run, although the United States is going to test that theory. But the hope is that the policy will be net cash positive. After all, recessions too collapse tax revenue. And in any case, in the long run, we are all dead anyway. Moreover, the Kremlin had been preparing for this moment for years with the creation of the Fortress Russia policy, and a rainy day fund intended to supplement spending should the West ever impose sanctions, which is exactly what happened. Of course, with everything shifting to a wartime economy, this countermeasure was easy to implement. Demand in the manufacturing sector was naturally spiking, as the Russian Ministry of Defense had endless orders to put in. The fact that Russian manufacturers were uncompetitive on the international market, at least for civilian goods, became irrelevant because all of the orders were for Russian use in Ukraine. But there is no such thing as a free lunch. Back to Russia's simplified economy. The slack in the energy sector and the rapid hiring in the manufacturing sector to produce weapons has slaughtered the service sector. Actually, this is misleading. Because the manufacturing was in weapons, and those weapons have no consumption value for Russian civilians, all of this has meant a rapid rise in inflation. Still, though, thus far, Russia has avoided the worst of Dutch disease. But now Ukraine is pushing the question further with its bombing campaign against Russian refineries. We have discussed this strategy before, but the basic idea is that Russia is quantity constrained on oil exports. It is the one thing that the price cap has done well. So if you eliminate Russia's ability to refine oil products, there is nowhere else for the crude to go. Now, Ukraine is far from completely destroying the entire Russian industry. As many attacks as there have been, refineries can be repaired, even if Russia may be struggling on that front as well. Of course, fog of war as it is, we do not have a great sense of exactly how much Russian capacity Ukraine has taken offline. The Kremlin is not exactly eager to provide Kyiv with updates on that front. But as of now, we are probably looking at something notable, but not game-ending. A report from Reuters estimates that refinery capacity was at about 86% by the end of March, but had rebounded to 90% in mid-April. Still, that is massive damage for a small number of drones. Further, it is possible that Russia was using Western-made spare parts to quickly rebound that 4%, and those spare parts may be in limited supply. If so, future repairs may not be as speedy, but that is speculation. And that leads us to the final question for today: what the war's near future might look like. We know that the United States is not happy with Ukraine's strategy, but let's suppose that Washington cannot convince Kyiv to lay off the refineries. If Ukraine were to produce those drones at scale, then Russia would be looking at an outright crisis. Even the smaller amounts of damage that we are currently seeing raise questions inside the Kremlin, though. It's not rocket science, but the duct tape around Russia's economy has worked thus far, showing it is resilient to the current level of sanctions. Back here on Earth, refinery damage will turn the knobs on Dutch disease further and put us in uncharted territory. The biggest red flag is that Russia has its arms manufacturing completely spooled up at this point. To inject further rubles into that sector would require significant capital investment for new factories. This will pull further from the service sector and thus further reduce the pool of available consumer goods for the average Alexanders out there. That means inflation, inflation, and inflation. In other words, the simple deficit spending solution from 2022 is no longer available. Consumers in Moscow and St. Petersburg will feel the pinch, putting further pressure on the social contract that keeps the Kremlin running. Actually, Inauguration Day was yesterday in Russia, so we should probably go with this updated photo. Anyway, the broader Russian economy is a problem. The remaining question is whether the Russian central bank can continue its winning streak and find another solution. But hey, it looks like Nabulina knows where to look for answers. And yes, this was hiding in plain sight earlier in the video. If you also want to get ahead on the intel, pick up a copy of one of my books on the war. You can check the video description below for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.